Hi, this is Kristin Donnelly, one of the hosts of Everything Cookbooks. Today's episode is one of a 6-part series during which we'll be re-releasing some of our favorite past conversations that focus on getting the deal. In this episode, we share the ins and outs of securing a cookbook deal, including how advances and royalties work, where you can maybe negotiate a little bit, and some of the financial realities. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back in April with a whole new lineup of host chats and guest interviews. Thank you so much for listening.
Wonder how cookbook ideas are sold? If you're interested in making a cookbook with a publisher, you gotta be ready to make a deal. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the bookish podcast for curious writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Andrea Nguyen, and joining me to discuss how cookbook projects get negotiated with publishers are my co-hosts, Kristin Donnelly, Molly Stevens, and Kate Leahy. Hello, ladies.
Hey.
Hey, Andrea.
Hi, everybody.
Well, I was just thinking before we got going here that we have been talking about cookbooks on a regular basis for a very long time, but I could not remember when that all started.
I mean, I know that it was before I'd ever heard the term Zoom. So we were using early forms of Google Meet or something to make it happen. So it must have been a while ago, right?
Monthly for 6 years, we've been hanging out on these little chats.
Yeah, and I joined a little bit later, but I think it's been at least 5 years for me.
Well, you know what? It's time that we share what we know, and I keep on learning about making cookbooks. In past conversations, we covered cookbook proposal writing as well as literary agents. Let's say that agent and you and your hustle got that beautiful sales pitch of yours into the hands of an interested publisher, and an offer is made. What's at stake? Let's start with the sexy stuff. The advance and royalties. There are different kinds of cookbook deals, and between the four of us, we've produced solo projects as well as collaborations. On my projects, I've always flown solo. My kind of book contract is relatively straightforward. When I negotiate one, it basically boils down to this. Do I want my money now, or do I want my money later? Molly, what's it been like for you?
You know, when you say money now or money later, Andrea, that's true in two cases. Money now or money later. In every book I've worked on, the advance, which is really an advance of money against the sale of the book. So the publisher is giving you money up front to write the book so they can get it published and then they can start selling it. So it's an advance against sales. In every case that I've been involved with, that advance is broken down into 3 or 4 payments. One upon signing. The second one is after I've shown proof of progress, halfway through the manuscript or something. There's some sort of vague proof of progress. Another part upon delivery. And then there's a final one that's a smaller increment that's at publishing. So that's money now and money later. It's like spread out across the process of creating the book. But I think money now, money later also is about how big is your advance, because if your advance is really big, then you won't see any royalties. And we might need to back up and explain how that all works. But so I see it as sort of twofold.
No, that's a great way to describe it. Yeah. The money now is how your advance is broken out. And when you're receiving the advance, you're receiving some now, you're receiving some later. And then if you're fortunate, you'll also receive royalties, but that comes much later.
And you'll know from your contract a lot of times how many books you're going to need to sell before you even start getting royalties. So I feel like most agents will go after that bigger advance because there's just no guarantee of earning out. But I know that there are some authors who actually prefer taking a lower advance to have the royalties. So
can I ask you guys a question? I think when I first saw a book contract, and we signed A16 without an agent. And I always thought that if you don't earn out your advance, you had to pay the money back. I thought, well, it's an advance. And if you don't the book isn't successful, don't you have to give the money back? I mean, this took me years to figure out. So can you guys just explain a little bit more about what an advance is? I'm thinking, shoot, am I suddenly going to be surprised 5 years down the road and owe somebody $5,000 or something?
Right. It's like they repossess your book, right? Like repossessing a
Oh my
house.
gosh, I never thought of it that way.
I didn't either till now that Kate brought that up.
Your advance you keep.
the advance, as was explained to me by an agent I was talking to years ago, is a loan you never have to repay.
That's a really succinct way to put that. I like it.
But it's not a loan. It allows you to write the book because writing a cookbook is expensive. And in my case, it certainly isn't, I don't want to say it's not income because it is, but pretty much all of it gets funneled back into the production of the book through the recipe developing expenses, the hiring of testers, all the things that go into creating a book.
Yeah. And a lot of times the author pays for photography out of that advance. So it really depends on the publisher, but there are very real expenses that go into creating the book.
Books are expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like cookbook advances have all, it's not a straight thing like you're sitting there writing fiction, right? So cookbooks are illustrated books, not meaning like people draw pictures necessarily. Sometimes they do. But let's talk about like who gets the pieces of the pie in a cookbook advance. So, cookbook advance, it's a loan, or better yet, realistically, I think of it as an investment in your idea. Mm-hmm. And the amount of the advance really depends on who you are, your first-time author, your platform, the marketplace for your book. So how many copies they think they'll sell. They're going to do something called a P&L statement to gauge the value of your idea. And then they'll make you an offer. And one of the things that I've got in show notes for folks is just like a really nice, succinct blog post on like how much money people can expect to get on a first-time book deal. But anyway, so cookbook advance is split among many people. Can we talk about that so people understand that it's not just your money to run off to Vegas to?
Absolutely. When it comes to creating a book, if you're, say, let's keep it simple. So solo author, I'm going to write a book, but I also have to have beautiful photos in my book. Cookbooks with photos are what people want. And when you're looking at your contract, some publishers will have an item in there where basically your advance is, say, we'll keep it simple. Say your advance is $50,000. They might flag $20,000, $15,000 for photography. So that's money that you actually never see. The photographer is going to be paid out of that advance. The money's never going to transfer to you. It's just going to directly to the photographer. And that's all handled by the publisher in some cases. In other cases, the publisher gives you that money, but they have it in the contract that you need to use that money to pay for photography. So photography is very expensive. Anyone who's done a commercial photo shoot for, say, brands, the cost of photography per photo for, say, one recipe for a food brand could be thousands of dollars. For cookbooks, photographers actually don't make a lot of money, but it's a prestige project for them. But for an author, it is a lot of money. $15,000 is a lot of money, especially when, say, you're not getting, that much upfront. So that's one of the things to look at.
It's such an important point because the first time around with the contract, I was so confused by this. It's like, wait a minute, that's my advance. Why is the photography budget coming out of it? Especially because I was very inexperienced. The publisher was controlling that whole photography piece. But if you think of it, as Andrea says, as an investment, it's the publisher's investment in this title. They want to earn all that back before they start paying any royalties. So that total $50,000 they need to earn back in book sales before anybody's going to see any royalties. So if you think about it that way, it helped me understand why it had to come out of what I saw as my budget.
I will say it's a very low percentage of books, I believe, that fully earn out their advance. I don't know the percentage, but should you publish a book or if you've published a book and you're nowhere near earning out that advance, do not panic. I always just give thanks to people like Ina Garten who sell so many books. And I feel like it helps subsidize it for the rest of us.
That's a really good point.
Right. Publishers put these numbers together because they want to invest in a wide ranging portfolio of books. So they're going to have, the big front list sales, blockbusters. And they're also going to have, other books, backlist, books and books that cater to other kinds of cooks and readers. So the author, the collaborator gets money too, right, you guys? The photographer within that photography budget, stylists, studio rentals. If you've got an illustrator, that can go in there too. My first 2 cookbook contracts, the photography budget was not included in my advance. And I was just like, you folks run with that photo budget. I had no clue. I just get the money for writing. But then once the photography budget started coming into my advance, I was like, hold on a second. I get to weigh in on who that photographer is and the team that is put together for my project. You guys don't get totally to, decide everything, because now I have to be sure that I can earn that money back and earn out. So I need to have a say. So that's something that can be, a point of negotiation in the contract too.
Yep. And I think the delivery schedule of the advance can be as well. Like I just laid out how it's worked for me, but you can negotiate if you want it paid out in portions or you want it all at once. I mean, it might depend on your tax situation. Like, it's November and you don't really want to get a big sum this year. Let's pay it out next time. I mean, you can negotiate that stuff.
You can to a point. You can negotiate it to a point when it comes to certain contracts. And now that there's fewer publishers out there, the contracts are getting a little bit more, the publishers just have more power than they did before. When, say, 10 Speed Press was an independent press and you didn't have to earn your photography budget out, they maybe give it smaller advances, but it just seemed to be almost a better deal. Now, with the Penguin Random House contract, it used to be you'd get your advance in 2 installments or 3 installments. Now it's pretty much a standard across the board, 4.
5.
Are you kidding me?
I thought it was 4.
Man.
Yeah. The cash flow for writing cookbooks. I mean,
it's not great.
Wait. I take that back.
Yeah.
I take that back. It was 4. And then I actually wanted 5. So I don't want to
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I misspoke for my publisher.
Got it.
Wanting to make them out to be the bad guys. And you know what? When you're negotiating, you got to be thinking that the publishers give it a little edge. The publisher is sort of like the bad person, your adversary, but also your collaborator. Keep that tension going, so that they know you mean business.
Yeah. Well, that contract is an intimidating thing. I mean, it's a 7, 8, 9, 10 page document that's pretty dense. And I, confess before to my trouble reading things like that. Even if you have an agent, you got to read it. You got to really try to figure out what it says and try to understand. And there are little places like, I know, the author's copies in the contract will say how many copies you get when the book comes out. And I think my original one said I get 10 copies. I'm like, no, I'm up with the 10 copies of my book for, I bought subsequent cases since then, but still, wouldn't it be nice to get a whole case of your books and things like that? I don't know if you still can negotiate those.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like the easy, sort of the low hanging fruit. If they're going to give you anything in a contract, more books? Sure.
Yeah.
Take more books.
I remember also one thing I negotiated on was the right to sell my book, because they had, I think they, in general, they want to push through bookstores, but I do have online commerce abilities. So I don't currently sell my book, but I was like, I want the option to, like, if I want to do that someday, I want to be able to sell my book. So that's another negotiating point.
So let's also remind folks and ourselves that the agent gets the 15% as well of that pie.
Yes.
We also want to talk about work for hire. I am not familiar with that as much as you, Kate and Kristin, are. Can you talk a little bit more about your experiences with that?
For me, it's been where it's often like there's already a deal, it's been negotiated, and then an author needs help with an aspect of the book, whether that's like pulling together the manuscript, developing some of the recipes or testing some of the recipes. So work for hire means basically your fee is a flat fee. There's no association with the advance or the royalties. The fee can range so much just depending on the scope of work, but it's something you agree to pretty early on. You might get paid like half up front and half when you're done. And then you never deal with the book until it comes out.
And the money is usually paid out from the author, not from the publisher.
Correct.
Unless it's a publisher work for hire. And that's something different. A publisher, I haven't done this, but I know people who have, say, a publisher comes to them and wants to do 70 recipes on a certain topic, and this is the amount of money they're going to give you. That's a completely different kind of deal.
Right. So you're a gun for hire and there's no royalties. You're just going in there, in and out. And I can see the beauty of something like that because you don't have to necessarily sell the book.
Right.
You're just doing it.
Yeah. It can be really great, but it can also be a little bit of a drag if you know that it's going to be a book that's going to sell well. Like if somebody came to you and was like, do this, especially a few years ago, do this Instant Pop book for $20,000 or something. And that might sound like a lot of money, but like the popularity of the Instant Pot and the way Instant Pot books can sell, it's like, maybe it's not the best deal ever.
Let's talk about royalties too. So, we say, well, if you're going for a big advance, you may not even pay attention to royalties. So then again, you're taking all the money now versus betting, on money later. Let's touch on like royalty escalators. I learned that early on, meaning that the more books you sell, the more books they sell with you, because, you, the author, aren't the only salesperson, the higher the royalty rate. Do you guys pay attention to the royalties that much?
I honestly put full trust in my agent on that stuff, only because he does deal with so many different publishers and book deals. So he's seen like the little book deals, the really big book deals. And so now has a better understanding, I guess, than I ever would of the options. So it's not something I pay a lot of attention to be honest.
The way, in my experience, there'll be a threshold in the contract that says if your book sells this many. After that point, you'll get 10% of every book sale. So if you have a $30 book, you get $3 off of the sale of that book. Your agent takes 15% of that, right? But then when the book hits the next threshold, it sells another 10,000, 20,000, whatever, how many thousands it has to sell. That royalty rate goes up. And I think that's what we're talking about as an escalator. So then you start getting 12.5% or whatever it is. So if you ever hit the number that pays back the advance fully, then you start to get a certain percentage, and that percentage goes up as those numbers climb. There are different rates, and this is where I am with you, Kristin. I really put faith in my agent to negotiate for this, but the foreign rights and ebook rights, and there's also like if they sell discount rates, and there are lots of other numbers in there, but the basic formula is the more you sell, the higher the percentage of return is.
One thing I would add to looking at royalty rates is understanding the idea that some royalty rates are based on the price of the book, and then other royalty rates are based on amount received, which I take to mean net. Andrea, is that what you take it to mean too?
Yeah, net. So after returns, so it's what the publisher sells your book for. So it's wholesale versus retail, you guys. Let's think about that. And wholesale means like what they sell it for, and then if any books are returned to the publisher, then you don't get those counted as part of your royalties, right, Kate?
Right.
Yeah, so those are like two ways that royalties are calculated, and you want to take a look at those numbers. So of course, when Molly's talking about the 10%, that would be at MSRP at the sale price, whereas you may expect, say 15% at the net price of the book sale. So, royalties are not going to come right away necessarily unless like you take a really low advance. But, if you're lucky, then maybe you're going to, have like a future income stream that you can share with your grandchildren.
I love getting my little check in the mail from A16 sales every 6 months.
Awesome.
And that's another thing. You get the royalty checks every 6 months once you earn out. So it's like a little surprise because you can't really count on it. And then it appears, you're like, wow, cool.
I
also think it back to episode 1, should you write a cookbook? What kind of book is it? Is this a book you think, hope, wish, dream will sell for years to come? Because if you're doing a book that's very timely and quick and on trend, it may not have, that might not be your goal to have a book that keeps selling for several years. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Maybe if it sells, 1 million copies out of the box, of course you'll see royalties, but the life of the book might determine whether you're going to take your money now or take your money later too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I actually earn royalties off of most of my books, but I have a different deal with the publisher and stuff. So, everybody has a different life and financial strategy. So you want to think about that when you're negotiating a contract. But there's like other stuff in the contract too that we want to pay attention to, not just the money. What other kinds of author obligations kind of like scare the pants off of you guys, when you're like reviewing that contract?
Well, like the author warranty that you're saying this is all your original work and it hasn't been published anywhere else. Of course it is, but you've just signed that is too. So, I know we're going to talk about recipe plagiarism and things like that down the road, but it's for real. This has to be your original work.
There's also for some publishers, a newer clause in contracts. I guess I'll call it a morality clause. They came up in the post-Me Too era, and for good reason. But especially as somebody who's a co-author, it's like, I work with people who I think are amazing, but it's like, there's always, you don't know everything they do. And there's always that small risk. I wouldn't worry about signing it for myself because I'm pretty boring. But I guess Morality Closet deals with various harassment and general behavioral issues.
And with the morality clause, are you saying that it's something that a publisher has the option to basically make this agreement null and void because of your actions?
You got it. Yep.
That's pretty heavy. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the nitty gritty stuff to think about too. The word count, the delivery dates, all that, that's like way up front in the contract too, just the nuts and bolts of how this is going to happen.
That's a really good point, because I remember when I turned in Modern Potluck, it was probably about 60,000 words. And I think the contract was for 45,000 words. I guess I just thought of it kind of like a school assignment where they weren't super strict about the page count. And she turned it right back to me and was like, can you cut 15,000 words?
Same thing happened to me once. Yeah.
Because when they're creating a book budget, the page count is really important for that. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of those things some publishers will allow for wiggle room, but in that case, they did not. I think I cut at least 10 recipes. And
wow. The other thing that the nitty gritty devil in the details that we want to mention are things like indexing. We will touch on indexing a little bit later, but the cost of indexing, it doesn't have to be a ton of money, but it is sometimes comes out of your advance. And oftentimes it does actually. And so, that's all part of the value. You just got to sell a few more books to get that royalty, or maybe just don't care. You just argue for more money up front, So just to kind of sum things up, I wanted to ask you guys, aside from the money, after you sign a cookbook deal, what's like the second most important thing that you think about after you sign that deal?
Deadlines.
So true.
How to get the work done.
So true.
What's the delivery date?
That's the scariest part to me. That's always like, oh my God, now what have I got myself into? I'm always scared when I start.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. It's totally the deadline.
And have you guys ever submitted anything late?
I'm in a situation right now where I'm submitting late, but it was a convoluted complication with COVID, working with a co-author who has had to grapple with opening and closing restaurants. And it's just been sort of the never-ending project. The publisher also pushed back the publication date, which is something we also can talk about a little bit. And so it's just, but it's not a good feeling. I mean, I've had conversations when this happens, and if anyone is in this situation where you're not going to deliver a manuscript on time, make sure you send that email or call your editor, because they need to have time. They need to know a couple of months ahead at least to know that this is not going to be feasible. And they might have to do some finagling with moving the date that your book is published because of changes in when you're going to be able to deliver the manuscript.
There's also some contracts allow for a grace period on the deadline, and it will say that. It's often a 30-day grace period. So I have handed in manuscripts late, but within that grace period. But I don't know that every contract has that.
I have missed deadlines wildly.
Molly Stevens?
Embarrassed to say it. I can't believe I'm admitting.
She comes clean on this podcast.
But I've never missed a magazine deadline or a short-term project deadline. But when it comes to the big books, I have run into some pretty big obstacles. And it's just taken a little longer. And I think just back to what you said, Kate, is communication is, a book that's 500 pages long or 400, whatever it is. It's not like you find out the week before it's due that you're not going to make it. Months ahead. I know a year ahead. I know I'm not going to make it. So I'm in communication with the editor about it. I don't, just try to hide and hope they won't find me, because they, have to deal with their list and their schedule and everything else. So things happen, and sometimes things do take longer than you think they will be. So it's not the end of the world, but I would say my first book was on time. It was ahead of time. It was in advance. So I know it's bad.
God, you guys, I learned so much. Thank you for bearing your soul.
Wait, how about you, Andrea? Have you ever missed a book deadline?
She tried to sneak out of that one.
I have submitted on time. I have submitted within the grace period. I have begged for extensions. I have negotiated extensions.
Yes.
So the upshot to our discussion about contracts is that there's flexibility for you as an author. And what's important is, building that relationship with the publisher, because you hope that's a relationship that you maintain for a long time.
While there's flexibility sometimes with the contracts, if you're not working with an agent, I recommend having a lawyer look at it because they can advise you on at least what you're signing.
I totally agree. And if you don't have an agent, you can join the Authors Guild and get your contract reviewed legally and professionally. Here at Everything Cookbooks, we relish listener questions. The other day, we received something from Mary about an evergreen issue. Here's Mary's question.
Hi, this is Mary from New Jersey. How do you come up with your recipe ideas? I have been cooking professionally for a lot of years, but now I want to write my own cookbook. I'm just wondering if all the recipes need to be original. Is it okay to use recipes that you've learned from other people? Thank you.
So this is something that I'm wondering all the time, whether I'm writing a recipe for a magazine article, newspaper, my books. How original can and do recipes need to be? What do you all think?
And if they're not original, or if you don't feel they're original, do you still use them? And if so, how?
Right. Yeah, it's a loaded question because people oftentimes say, well, what is a recipe? How original can it be for like boiling eggs? Right. But Mary has an intriguing question because she's a longtime professional chef and she's looking to put together her own book. What about recipes that she learned from other people? How would you incorporate something like that?
There's almost like two different questions there because there are recipes like, let's say, pasta carbonara or something where there are millions of versions of that and certain rules to follow if you want it to be classic. But then there's also somebody else's more original recipe or original riff on a recipe. And I kind of see them two different ways. So it's like if you know that exact inspiration or that exact person who created a recipe and you either want to include their recipe or riff on their recipe, there is never harm in acknowledging that in a head note. And I encourage it. I think the more you can give credit, the better. But then when you go back to something like pasta carbonara, in some ways you might think like, does the world need another pasta carbonara? But in a collection of recipes that might be your own, there is like a curation aspect to that. So maybe it makes sense for you to have that recipe in there and you have a story behind it or a little way you do it that's a little bit different, or even if it's not different, a way you learned from somebody. So all of that, it adds up into the originality of a recipe. That's my take.
Yeah, because, a book is an original work in the sense that the way the context is presented along with the recipe instructions make it a copyrightable entity. And I think that when you're putting together a book, it's more than just the recipes, but how do the recipes help you illuminate your personal human experience? And if there's something in New Jersey, for example, that speaks to pasta carbonara or, maybe even an egg salad, sandwich, something that is so common, but yet you do it in your personal way that embodies your life experiences, that's your recipe. And I would say that loud and proudly. And if your mother or a best friend contributed to that recipe in some way, then by all means, give a shout out to them because that person is part of your community. Even a book that you found a certain inspiration from, or not even inspiration, but information, you can just say, I learned something from that. I never think that it's a problem to come up with recipes because there are always going to be more recipes to write in the future. But I know people just think, well, what's mine and what isn't?
It would be a dangerous world if all recipes were copywritten. So say you wanted to have hard-boiled eggs, but you'd have to get the rights for a hard-boiled egg recipe from somebody who said they were the first. And then you'd have your deviled eggs and then you'd have to buy the rights for the deviled eggs. Like it would be sort of like being a musician, and with music, that is all copyright. You can't just kind of like go about and take somebody's lyrics and music and use it for your own song. In recipes, we're always sort of iterating on somebody who came first. For example, if somebody comes up with this original recipe and it's beloved, somebody else is going to want to make it and make it their own and put their own twist on it. So these recipes are always evolving. But Kristin, you're exactly right. At the end of the day, it comes back to what do you want to say? And how does that relate to this recipe? Why, if there are so many recipes for carbonara, why should it even be in this collection? And that comes back to your personal story, how you're putting that personal spin on it. But at the same time, I mean, this is a tricky situation because there's people who just blatantly lift people's stories as well as their recipes and call it their own. So it's a touchy subject.
It doesn't sound like Mary's talking about blatantly lifting. And I think that
Are you, Mary? Please say you're not doing that.
Please say you're not. And it goes back to what we talked about in episode 1. Should you write a cookbook? Do you have recipes that you feel are original? And by original means recipes that you have been making, that you know how to make, that you love, that are near and dear to you. Sure, if you become a cookbook author, a frequent magazine contributor, you are constantly developing new recipes. So you're always looking for new material. But you know if it's your recipe, you know if you've worked on it, and you know where the original idea came from, and you know how far you've strayed from that original idea. And I think that goes back to Kristin, what you're talking about, that it's a matter of your personal integrity as an author, that where did this recipe come from? How much is it yours? How much have you been influenced by other people? And tell that story. And if that story that is one that needs to be on the page, then you tell it on the page. And I agree with you, Kristin. It never hurts to give acknowledgement to where the recipe comes from.
Absolutely. And fortunately, that's becoming more and more acceptable. I think before it was, if you gave too much acknowledgement to people in your head notes, people would think, well, why do you have any business writing a cookbook to begin with? And now it's sort of like, no, the acknowledgement is part of the story of like where are these recipes and how they originate and how they evolve and the history behind these recipes. And that can all be glimpsed in a really good head note.
Most definitely. So hopefully we've allayed some of Mary's concerns about recipe originality and that she will plow forward with her project and write something beautiful.
Go, Mary.
We'll dive into more of the nitty-gritty recipe writing techniques in future episodes. But meantime, do any of you have a writing tip to share?
I'll ask the group here. You are all such wonderful recipe developers. What are your thoughts on butter? Is it a stick of butter? Is it a tablespoon of butter? Is it a half cup of butter? Like what do you like to say? Tablespoons, cups, weight? How do you do your butter in recipes?
I hate cups in butter. That's a very popular style for certain publishers, but I hate that style. I like sticks and tablespoons, and sometimes I'll say 1 stick, 8 tablespoons. But I don't measure butter in cups, and I don't know that everybody knows that 8 tablespoons is a half cup.
Oh God, I struggle with this one because I think sticks is certainly sticks and tablespoons. I agree, Kristin, but then I'm all like, well, more and more people are getting into there's sort of these handcrafted butters or butter, they're making their own butter, so that's why I tend to do a stick or a tablespoon and then weight. That's a way around it. 4 ounces, 8 ounces, things like that. So
that's fair.
That gets around it for me too.
I think that's fair.
How about you, Andrea?
I'm with Kristin. I'm like, as soon as I think about cups, I'm like, oh God, I gotta like mush it. I gotta like
mushing it into the cup.
Yeah,
you're gonna melt it first a little bit so it fits into the cup, and then disaster.
Yeah, and then I think about other fats, shortening, duck fat, all that, lard. Oh my goodness, and all of a sudden, then like the nightmare piles up, and I'm feeling extremely greasy all over.
Yeah. So weight can get around it because if you
weight always wins in the end. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
You guys, I learn so much from you every single time. I know I've said that before, and I'm going to say it once again, especially, when we get together like this on a regular basis. And I thank you for talking about the deal today.
It's so great to talk about because we don't talk about these things. We sit in our work on our own, and if we have an agent, you can talk to your agent, or if you have someone to represent you, you can talk to, but it's really nice to be able to share and learn from you guys too.
Absolutely.
Hooray, it was so fun, Andrea.
Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have further questions or comments, ping us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks or send us a message at our website, everythingcookbooks.com. Tons of gratitude goes out to our editor, Abigail Circatella. If you have a few seconds to spare, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, which will help more people find the show. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.